it was a sense that I was not who I had always believed myself to be made up of. And what did that mean?
Welcome to DNA Clarity and Support. I'm your host, Brianne. Listen as I chat with authors and leaders in the DNA world about the family and personal impacts of DNA testing. You'll hear news stories, unique perspectives, find out about books, websites, organizations, other podcasts for those involved in the world of DNA. Please be sensitive to younger listeners as the conversations can get intense at times. This is a production of Watershed DNA. Learn more at watersheddna.com. Today's guest on DNA Clarity and Support podcast is Dani Shapiro, the author of the New York Times best-selling memoir, Inheritance. Dani has also written 4 other memoirs, 5 novels, and is the host of an original podcast, Family Secrets, launched in February of 2019. Dani lives with her family in Litchfield County, Connecticut. Hi, Dani. Thank you for coming on today.
Hi, Brianne. Thanks for having me. It's good to talk to you.
You as well. So I've invited you on today so we could talk a little bit about your NPE discovery. NPE, for those who are not familiar with that acronym yet, means not parent expected. And it came from an original term, non-paternity event or non-parental event. And in your memoir, Inheritance, Dani, you talked a little bit about how a DNA test ultimately revealed to you a different story about your father and where you came from. And so looking back on your story, I wondered if you could give us just a synopsis of how it came to be that you had DNA testing and made this discovery.
Sure. So really, when I look back on it now, my decision to take a home DNA test wasn't even really a decision. It was more like a lark. My husband, Michael, was interested in doing a DNA test himself, really also for kind of recreational reasons, just to see if there were any distant relatives that he hadn't, been aware of who were on there, or maybe, some fun facts about his ethnicity. He was really doing it, I think, because his dad, my father-in-law, was elderly, and he thought it would be a good bonding conversation to have with him if he discovered anything interesting. And he asked me if I wanted to do it too. And, I'm haunted by this sometimes still, because I so easily could have said, no, you go ahead and do that. I don't need to do that, because I had no particular interest or curiosity in anything more about my ancestry than I already knew. I was pretty solid on that score. I knew where I came from. I knew quite a bit about my father's ancestors in particular, but also my mother's and, my ethnicity. And so it was really just for no reason other than, turn right, turn left. I just happened to do it.
So it wasn't like you had an inkling that the test might reveal something to you you didn't already know about yourself, or you didn't really have any gaps in your family tree, even in the distant past, that you were trying to fill in, really.
No, certainly not. Although, from where I sit now, and I try not to supply too much sort of retrospective knowledge to my motives back then, because I'm a writer and I've written so many books, I can actually look back at my actual body of work, both my fiction and my nonfiction. And it's really just right there in black and white that on some level, I knew that there was a secret. I knew that something was amiss. I knew that something didn't make sense. I always was driven by that knowledge, but I really did not know what it was and could not have possibly articulated to myself, oh my gosh, I wonder whether maybe my father isn't my biological father. I mean, that never, ever consciously entered my mind.
And there wasn't anything that really could have prepared you for that. Like if there had been a big flashy hazard sign on the side of the DNA test kit that was warning you, you might learn something you totally were not expecting. It's not like that was even on your radar as a
Well,
possibility.
yeah, that messaging on, on the websites of DNA companies, at least at that time, I don't know if it's still the case, is just like such fine print that you really have to kind of strain your eyes to even see it. But even if there had been a larger warning, I still would have done it, and I would have checked the box that I was interested in having anyone with whom I shared DNA show up along with my results, because I didn't have any inner flashing red lights.
Yeah. So is there any other life experience that you could compare it to, that finding out from your DNA test that the father you always knew and loved was not genetically related to you?
Gosh, that's such a great question. I'm someone who has had a couple of shocks in my life. I lost my father when I was 23 in a car accident, an accident that almost killed my mother. So I was no stranger to shock and to grief. I also, when my son was an infant, he was very ill for a period of time. That was also shock and grief. This was something altogether different. The quality of it was different. I certainly felt shock, but it was like the atmosphere itself was shock. Like there was nothing distinguishing me from it, like me from this experience. It wasn't something that was happening to me. It wasn't something that was happening to someone I loved. It was something that was me. It was a sense that I was not who I had always believed myself to be made up of. And what did that mean? It was like, the very atmosphere itself had shifted and changed almost instantly. And there was, I could recognize there was shock and all of the kind of classic things that go along with shock. My body was shaking. I was dizzy for weeks afterwards, really kind of disoriented, really feeling a kind of groundlessness. Like if my dad, who I had always believed to be my dad biologically and socially, was not biologically my dad, then what did that mean? Like, what made me me? It was like trauma at the level of identity. I don't know how else to put it than that. It was, when we're small and we're told stories about ourselves or how we've come into the world, those stories are the basis of our identity. It's how we form our identity. And I always feel like it's very important for me to make this distinction, because a lot of adoptees have read inheritance and have really related to it in a lot of ways. Adoptive parents have sometimes been like worried as they were reading it, because they thought, well, what am I saying? Am I saying that that's all that matters, that biology is all that matters? And the thing about adoptees is that, generally speaking, adoptees are told from the time they're very small.
They don't learn about their parentage from a DNA test. It's
Right.
typically come from another person.
They grow up knowing that there isn't a biological connection, and that there might be some question marks having to do with their biological origins, but those questions are woven into the very fabric of their existence. I'm not saying that that's easy. It's just very, very different from being certain about where and whom you come from and being wrong, or having a secret having been kept from you.
Yeah. Almost like there are different types of NPE experiences. And part of the difference is when that discovery is made, if it's always part of their own self identity compared to someone who learns it as a young adult or later in life. You pointed out that it's like almost a type of grief and shock, the stages of grief. We're starting to understand more about what that looks like for someone who's going through a discovery about their genetic parentage. And that loss of identity is something that can't be rebuilt immediately, and sometimes can't be rebuilt without seeking answers to some basic questions. So, how much of your experience at the very beginning of your discovery was in your head versus how much of it do you recall being like a physical reaction?
Hmm. It's an interesting question. I mean, I think it was such a kind of holistic, like, head and body. And it was kind of everything. It was just the field of me. There certainly was in my head and sort of intellectually, I write a lot about this in the book. There was this like sort of urgency to learn everything that I possibly could immediately. And, both of my parents were gone. And I was propelled by this feeling that there might still be people who were living who might know something about what had happened. And so my brain was very, very sharp. The way that I think sometimes happens when people are in shock, also, it was kind of a survival mechanism. My husband, who's a former journalist, and I've written a good deal of journalism myself, we were rabidly trying to figure out as much as we could, as quickly as we could. And that also served to distract and occupy me and kind of keep me away from some of the more tender, vulnerable, disturbing aspects of this. I mean, it initially felt like such a loss to me. I was extremely close to my dad and adored him. And, as I said, he died when I was pretty young. And I, spent many years really just internalizing him and thinking of him all the time. And in the very beginning, that felt shaken. And it felt shaken because I didn't know whether this was a secret that he had always kept from me. I didn't know whether he knew or didn't know. And so much of my activities and my actions in those first weeks had to do with just trying to discover as much as I could. But at the same time, I was physically reeling. Like I really did feel, like I would look at my hand and I would think, whose hand is this? Or what I write about in the book in terms of looking at my face in the mirror, I think I had always puzzled about my face in the mirror. And now I knew why I had always puzzled. But it was like, as you said, sort of subtracting, everything I had always been certain about and trying to like sit with the mystery of, well, what am I? Like, I really thought, well, who am I? Like, am I still the person that I was 3 hours ago before I made this discovery? We don't think about our identities in this way when we're just growing up in families, and we just kind of take for granted that, we're a part of, or we come from this fabric or this world. And then when that's torn, there's, I think, a lot of reckoning to do and ultimately a lot of healing to do.
In speaking with many different NPEs over the past couple of years, there's some common comments that NPEs hear that to them is dismissive or is just not a helpful comment. And one of those common comments is, well, you're still the same person that you were before. And from an outsider's perspective, it sounds like it would be reassuring, but from the experience, is that type of comment, does that have any constructive use?
That's interesting. I thought you were going to say, no matter what, your father's still your father, but we can get to that.
That's another one. I think there's an article on Severance magazine that's the top 10 things, something like the top 10 things to not say to an NPE. And one of them is your dad's still your dad. And another one is you're still the same person you were before.
Right. I think that in the beginning, I found that comment, no matter what, you're still you. I think I actually found that somewhat comforting because I felt so shattered. And the fact is, I was still me. I had always been me. I just hadn't known what that me was comprised of. But in fact, like there was this way in which pretty quickly some of this discovery began to make a lot of sense to me. And I should say here that I think part of the reason for that in my case is because I was able to very, very quickly identify my biological father, and he was still living. And I was able to find him on the internet. And so I had very quickly something to begin to fill in the blanks and to go like, oh, of course, like even just on a purely physical level, like, oh, that's who I look like. Wow, that is who I look like. Or, oh, that's why I have small hands, or why my nose gets pink when I get upset. Or, but on a deeper level, it was also, there were things about me that I had never understood, that had never really added up or made sense. And I could have articulated this even well before my discovery that I was an NPE, which was that, like, constitutionally, really did not make all that much sense given who my two parents were. There was something in me that actually was sort of steadier and just had a very different energy than either of my parents. And of course, that can happen in an entirely biological family. And that's what I assumed was the case, was just that I was some sort of unicorn. But when I found out, there really was this feeling of like, oh, that makes sense. So I guess, being an NPE, there will always, I think, be that feeling of it's really hard for someone who has not had this experience or been like up close, very, very intimate with this experience to really understand what it feels like. And, when I was writing Inheritance, I was actually very aware of that. What I wanted to do more than anything was universalize the experience so that someone reading it who had no experience with anything like this would be able to empathize and sort of walk a mile in the shoes of someone who has been through something like this, because it really is like, it is a very alienating thing. And so I think whatever that list of 10 things not to say are, the attempt to normalize it is, I think, the issue, because it's not normal. It's never gonna be normal. And the people, the many, many thousands of people who have had or are going to have this experience, like, need to have their experience validated. And part of validating it is maybe even a version of, you know what, I can't actually imagine what it is that you're feeling. Do you want to tell me about it? Instead of just rushing to fix it, which I think is human nature.
Yeah. I have recommended your book so many times to people that have joined the support group I run, or in, just discussions online that go on in different social media groups. And prior to your memoir Inheritance being available, there were really not a lot of books, memoirs, resources to give to people. And now we're estimating possibly 1 million people have made this kind of discovery just from a DNA test. And so I'm really grateful to you for having written on this topic. I know that writing memoirs is something that you did before, and looking back and something that I think memoirists do that maybe the rest of the world does not do is looking back and seeing your history through a different pair of glasses, and almost reliving that past as the person you are now compared to the person that you were then. And it makes me wonder how your relationships in your life have changed and what surprised you about this particular experience in your life having an impact on your closest relationships. Do you want to talk about any of those ones?
Thank you for saying that about inheritance. It really felt to me like, well, I guess I was born to write this. I mean, the fact of making that kind of discovery and being someone who has plumbed, the depths of, family and memory and identity and has always been, deeply interested in all that. It was like, when people said, when did you decide you were going to write a book about this? I was like, I didn't decide. It was what I had to do.
Like a compulsion that you didn't really have a say.
No, I felt like, I felt like, I understand that this is my purpose, on the planet, is that I'm going to be the person who writes this book. Because as you said, when I read everything that there was to be read in the English language on this subject, at like everything, pamphlets from New Zealand, and I was so grateful when there was anything or anyone, where it felt to me like, oh, I am not alone. And it's, when people contact me or, when people come to my events, the main thing that I say to other NPEs is you are not alone. You are so far from alone. And, the work that you're doing is about creating that sense of community as well, which is so important. But so in terms of my closest relationships, well, first of all, my husband, Michael, was so completely in this with me from minute one. And I've often wondered what it would have been like if I had been married to someone, with a partner who didn't get it, and how hard that would have been. He really got it. And I can honestly say never once said anything that felt like off to me. He had just a tremendous amount of compassion for my experience. And then, one of the people that I don't have a lot of family on my mother's side. My mother's gone. She has an older brother who's still living, who is 103 now, I believe. And this is actually an interesting story. I did go see him and his wife, and this is maybe now 3 years ago. So maybe he was 100 and she was 98. And we had dinner, the two of them and my husband, Michael, and myself. And it was very hard to explain to them what had transpired. It was very hard. And these are really, really bright and educated and very together people. I mean, they drove to the restaurant themselves in their car. And he teared up at a certain point and he said, so what are you telling me, Dani? Are you telling me that your father wasn't your father? And all of a sudden I realized that he, my uncle, is the father of an adopted daughter. And he could only hear my story through the lens of that for him, it was invalidating himself as an adoptive father because I was upset to find out that my father hadn't been my biological father. So that was some sort of heavy lifting, and I'm not sure we ever got all the way there. But then, like the opposite example of that, I went to see my father's younger sister, my Aunt Shirley, who I write about in the book, who was at the time 93. And she lives in Chicago and I live in Connecticut. So I flew there for the afternoon and I really didn't know how it was going to go. She is a devout Orthodox Jew. She has 4 children and 17 grandchildren, and I've lost count of her great-grandchildren. So, blood was very important, family very important, roots incredibly important. And she and I were very close, and I didn't know how she would take it. I knew she'd be kind no matter what, because she's an enormously kind person. But I was afraid I would see something on her face that would let me know that, you know what, this does matter. This means we are not blood, and that matters. I was so terrified that I would see that. And instead, what I saw and felt from her on that day was the opposite of that. She was so loving. I think it was actually the beginning of my being able to heal. I remember, and I write about this in the book, she said, Dani, you are not an accident of history. And she's 93 years old, and I'm telling her something that's so radical. I mean, when she was born, there weren't cars, I'm telling her something that's so radical for her to be able to comprehend. And she somehow was able to intuit what that would feel like to me. I did feel like an accident of history. And, the thing is, we're all accidents of history. Every single one of us, one sperm, one egg, wherever that egg comes from, that moment is an accident of history, and it was the beginning of my being able to heal, because I thought, like, mine is just more complicated than most. But okay, like what she's saying to me is, you were meant to be here exactly as you are, exactly as who you are. And that was an incredibly beautiful thing.
And that's exactly what you were needing to hear.
Yes.
In that time.
Yes. Which in a way is a version of you're still you. It's just a much deeper version.
I think it can be confusing sometimes for people who know you really well to understand what's happening when your behavior starts to change so quickly. So what I'm thinking of is, for some people, when they make their NPE discovery, it's such an overwhelming time that they don't even understand their own behavior. They might be acting differently, losing sleep. For some, it can cause a mental health crisis. It's a kind of trauma, and how people react to that can be so different. And especially for partners or spouses who maybe in the past they took on a much more like a fix-it role, where they could try to step in and help and fix the situation. And this really isn't a situation that can be fixed or needs to be fixed. It's something that takes time and understanding. And you mentioned empathy, which comes more easily to some people than others. So speaking of your husband, Michael, do you think he'd be willing to answer a few questions just about his memories of the experience? And because I think that could be really helpful to other spouses and partners who will find themselves in that role of the main support person for a spouse or partner who's made an NPE discovery. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I know he'll be happy to talk about it.
Well, I really appreciate you stepping in the room to answer a few of the questions that I have.
Sure.
And Dani and I have been talking about her NPE discovery, and I know from reading her book that you were involved in helping make sense of her DNA results when they came back. And it sounds like you did much of the legwork to piece together the family that she was matching to using DNA databases.
Right.
And I'm wondering about when it turned from being almost like investigative work into an emotional experience for Dani. And did you have an emotional reaction to see what she was going through?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this may be revisionist history to a certain extent, but I do know for a fact, I understood before Dani did what was probably going on. So it kind of settled in with me, but we didn't bring it up because I wasn't sure.
Do you think it was a couple of days before or hours? Or
Well, I'm trying to remember the exact timing of we got the fact that the 50 to 53%, whatever it was, Ashkenazi Jewish. And then that it didn't really dawn on me at that point. It was when we saw this first cousin there. Then the two of those factors kind of came together. And I believe that that was a couple of days before we started tracking it down.
So you knew before Dani did what was most
I
likely.
knew, but I didn't know. I wasn't completely sure, but it was a kind of a strange thing. But I think I was emotionally involved immediately because I never knew Dani's father, but he's always been very, very much a part of our lives in a way. You know, we honored him at our wedding, and at Jacob's bar mitzvah. And there was always a sense, there are photographs of him in the house. And we've also stayed close to Dani's aunt, her father's younger sister. And that was sort of a way of kind of, keeping that family together. And that Dani didn't have a lot of family left. And I did. And so it was nice to feel all of those connections. And so I think I was emotionally invested in her journey because of that. And also, I could sort of start to see what it was doing to her, obviously.
Yeah, you were probably the first person to really be able to see what was going on for her because you were there with her.
Yeah, I was there, and I don't know. It's strange to, again, you're thinking back on how things actually kind of dawn on you over time. And I think at the very beginning, it was the detective. I'm a former journalist by trade. And so the idea of I'm going to track this down, we're going to figure this out, I'm going to investigate this, that kind of...
It was like a natural reaction for you.
Yeah, and it's a way I think psychologically let's block out all of the emotional parts of it, and we've got a lot to do now.
I think some people, in particular, spouses who have an urge to try to make things better right away, don't really like that feeling of not knowing what to do or what to say or how they can help. What would you say to other people who find themselves in your shoes, being the main support person, and they're not really prepared to go through this discovery, but sometimes end up needing to be the rock or needing to be that support? What thoughts do you have for those individuals?
Well, I think what I did came very naturally to me to do. But I also think that, and we just know this from being out in the world, that there are an awful lot of people who really have that attitude. Well, what difference does it make? It's just, this genetic material, and the person who raised your father is still your father, which I felt from the very beginning that suggestion that Dani was getting from people was something that did get under her skin.
So you knew not to say that she would interpret as dismissing.
Yeah, and that is dismissive. And you would know this much better than I would, but that not everybody would necessarily perceive this kind of news as traumatic. I think most people would. And from the outside, I know for a fact that it's hard for outsiders to really understand how traumatic it is. You just need to know that it is. One of the things that struck me, and it still strikes me, is, because we have a son, he has a grandfather. And this other person who we didn't know is his grandfather.
Like a bonus grandfather.
Well, it's a bonus, but see, he never knew Dani's father either. So his emotional connection to him was pretty much non-existent. But in terms of the real world implications of this in our lives, that's kind of seismic for a kid to grow up and thinking, and then suddenly at 16 realize that, whoa, there's this person out there who is my grandfather.
Is that something that was a realization to you right away, that there might be more implications to this discovery for your own son?
Well, that there were implications, but that it's something that affected me personally. because here's someone I'm genetically related to, who is also, there's news about his genetic background.
I see. Yeah.
I think that emotionally, that was my, other than my emotional connection to it through Dani, I had an emotional connection to it through my son. So I think that it was pretty clear to me what was, the emotional toll this was taking on her, and the way that it also settled in over time a little bit. I think when it first started, it was, we both found ourselves telling this story over and over and over and over again, about what happened, how we were able to track down her biological father so quickly. And, by telling that story, you kind of, I think emotionally, it puts up a little bit of a force field,
Well, it makes it more real, I guess, the more that you talk about it.
Yeah, I think it makes it more real, but it also, I find it's a way to almost distance yourself from it. Here's a story. We've got this, this happened, this was exciting. We got on an airplane, we did this, and you can kind of tell it in a way that almost puts it outside of you. Does that make sense?
It does, creates.
It becomes a thing unto itself.
Yeah.
And then I think that, it also, I think, slowed the emotional response to it somewhat, and I think the real emotional and traumatic impact of it took a while to, at least from my side, to become really, really apparent.
So there was almost a bit of a delay between experiencing it and then really having to work through what the emotional impact of that was.
Yeah.
Did you experience it as a trauma yourself, or a trauma through Dani?
I did through Dani, I would say, although I understood what that history meant to her, what the family history meant to her, what the lore of the family, and her father and her grandfather. And we have, Dani might have mentioned this, but we have old film that her grandfather took going back to the shtetl in Poland where the family came from. And this, in that you see gravestones of her great grandfather and all of that. So there was this real connection to that kind of dated back through time. And I think for Dani, especially because she doesn't look Jewish, that having that was a very much of a stabilizing factor in her life. It was very, it was, there was bona fides there, there.
Yeah.
And so you kind of lose that, and you kind of lose this whole foundation. I can only imagine if I were to learn now and I don't have nearly the family history or the family connections that she did, but if I were to find out at this point in my life that my father wasn't my father, I think it would flip me out pretty much. I'm in my 60s, and that's not, and he's gone, and I think I'd feel completely unmoored. And I think in Dani's case, it's much, much more extreme than that, because I don't have the stories. I haven't grown up with the lore that she did.
So Dani, you have talked about your discovery as being traumatic to you. And I know people process trauma in different ways. And I was wondering if you could share with us what you have turned to as a way of working through your trauma, and if there are resources in particular that you think others might benefit from knowing about.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I would say that in the immediate aftermath of my discovery, I wasn't in therapy at the time, and nor had I felt any need to be in therapy. And then suddenly I felt a great need to be sorting this out somehow. And at the time, I felt like, well, I can't go to someone that I've never known before, because they won't know the me before. Like, they won't know the me who always, who believed that my dad was my dad, and that, that didn't know any about any of this. And so I went back to see a therapist who I had seen years before. And it was very briefly a little bit helpful, but it was, one of the reasons why I'm so glad you're doing the work that you're doing, Brianne, is that so little, even 4 or 5 years ago, was understood about what the landscape is. I've had therapists say to me, well, no matter what, your father's still your father. I'm like, oh, thanks a lot. I hope that made you feel better.
And now we have a growing network of therapists and counselors that understand the area of NPE.
Exactly. But it has grown so rapidly that, in 2016, when I made my discovery in my research, I didn't come across therapists who were, really specializing in this or, sort of being out there, letting people know that they were specializing in it. And so, therefore, I found that talk therapy with someone who wasn't as steeped in the knowledge of what an experience like this can, feel like, actually just started feeling like I was talking in circles. I was talking and not getting anywhere. It's in fact, it almost felt like it was re-traumatizing me to just be talking about it. And because I was writing, which I've got to say, for your listeners, whether you're writers or not, writing is really helpful and really therapeutic. Journaling about it, just putting pen to paper, being, sort of intimate with your own experience can be incredibly helpful. I think a lot of people find, but so I was starting to put together a book, which I was also finding helpful, but I knew that I was kind of on shaky ground emotionally. I had a lot of dizzy spells. I had never been dizzy ever in my life. And I've heard from a lot of NPEs that dizziness is something that really comes up, which I find so interesting. It was freaking me out. I didn't know what to do about it. I was kind of reliving the shock over and over again of the discovery itself, and then the discovery of my biological father, which was also a shock. And I ended up feeling like perhaps a trauma-based therapy might help me. And, I knew about EMDR through a friend who's a therapist.
Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Right. And I always knew about it, and I knew that people found it very effective, but I had never had any reason to experience it. And I actually reached out to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk through a mutual friend just to talk to him because he's such an expert on trauma. He wrote The Body Keeps the Score, and he very kindly, met with me, and we sat, in his home by the fire one winter, and I told him the whole story. And I really was just asking him, what do you think would help? And he said, I don't know if EMDR will help you because generally it's prescribed for, a traumatic incident. Someone,
a lot of
been through an assault or an accident or a war, or, it became very well known after 9/11. Many first responders were treated with EMDR. But I had this feeling that it might help me. And through a friend, I was able to get a consultation with really, really talented therapist who does EMDR. And when we were having our consultation, I said to her, what it feels like is that I am the trauma. Like my body is the feeling of having not known where I came from and not knowing that I didn't know, and these layers of sort of secrets and, mystery. I kept on replaying that again and again, which is what we do with trauma. We replay it again and again. And I think it took maybe 2 or 3 sessions working with her. EMDR, if it's effective, is effective often very quickly. And it just took the charge out of the particular images and scenes that I was replaying again and again, discovering that my dad, that I wasn't his biological daughter, discovering that I was donor conceived, words I had never heard before. It was like suddenly there was all this language in this whole world that I knew nothing about and had nothing to do with me until, in fact, it was me. That's what I was. When I first saw the phrase donor conceived, I just railed against it. I mean, I was like, I don't want to be. I don't want to be donor conceived. I want to be my father's biological daughter. I want to go back to what I always believed was the truth of my identity, but I don't get to do that. This is the truth. And so how do I metabolize it? And EMDR was enormously helpful.
Helped with that.
Yeah.
Work. So in addition to a little bit of talk therapy, the EMDR, which seems to have been really helpful in your situation, and writing about your experience, do you have other resources that maybe didn't exist back when you were looking into everything you could put your fingers on online? Are there other places that you now recommend to people who are making a discovery and maybe talking to you at, I guess we're not talking in person right now to people, but online or through virtual events?
Yeah. I mean, I've continued. I think I traveled to 40 cities when we were still doing things like traveling. And I've continued to do virtual events that often end up being gathering places for NPEs and adoptees and, anyone whose lives, I mean, increasingly just about every day now, more and more people's lives are being touched by secrets. They're coming out because of, largely because of DNA testing and also the internet. In 2016, as I said, I, didn't have a sense that there was a community. And, to go back to something that you said earlier, when we find out something of this magnitude is as important as what we find out. And, I had a real moment of kind of clarity at some point in the first year or so where I thought, I felt very betrayed by my parents, that they, in all likelihood, knew exactly what, they were doing and made the decision that was absolutely the recommended medical decision of the time, which was to never tell the child. It felt like a betrayal in many ways. And that was something I really had to work through. But the clarity was, if this had come out when I was a teenager or when I was in my 20s, or if my mother had told me after my father died, which happens sometimes, at the time, I think that would have been much, much rougher for me than finding out in my 50s at a time in my life where I was very kind of settled into my life, into my family life, had a really strong support system. Because if I had found out as a young woman or as a teenager, there wouldn't have been any community. And the lack of community would have contributed to that sense of complete and total, like freakish alienation that I really do think a lot of people feel when they first make this discovery. But now there are communities, there are private Facebook groups. I did an event, I believe it was for CC Moore and DNA detectives.
There's the Right to Know organization.
I don't know about it.
They're part of the, so there's a collective of NPE support organizations, and I have a link to them in the resources tab on watersheddna.com. It's a collective of individuals, counselors, journalists, podcasters, support organizations, and everyone's come together to advocate to the testing companies to make it a lot more accessible to find support for people who make that surprise discovery, because so many people like yourself made a discovery about an NPE and there was really nowhere to turn, and there was no cohesiveness of the community back in 2016. that 2016 is when I started Watershed DNA. And at that time, I was also looking for resources to send people to, and they didn't exist as far as I could find back then. And so that's when I started a private support group on Facebook that we've now moved it off of Facebook to a more private site called Mighty Networks. That's the Watershed DNA Mighty Network. And there's so much more now, so many more places to turn for support, not just for NPEs, but also the biological family that is discovered. So they're going through a shock and a surprise and sometimes a traumatic experience as well, with their family identity changing. When, they didn't realize that there were more genetic family members until the DNA test discovered them. And so there's small support groups for the bio dads that are being discovered and their wives and their existing families. There really is a ripple effect. And the more support that's available for everybody that's involved in these discoveries, the better it is for everyone, because it's creating that community of understanding and validation and support that's so critical that didn't exist back in 2016 yet.
I'm very moved by that. And if you send me a link, I will put the link to Right to Know Collective on the resources page on my website, because one of the things that, a really amazing, miraculous, strange, unintended consequence of my book coming out is that which was 2019, was that there was still this feeling of where do we go? I mean, I remember the first time I gave a reading on my publication date in New York City. I walked into the bookstore and there was wall to wall people. There were hundreds of people, and I thought, who are these people? How do they know that my book came out today? And they were old men who I realized were, oh my God, why are old men at my readings? Oh, these are the donors.
Yeah.
And then there were couples sitting there like holding hands and looking stricken. I was like, who are these people? Oh, these are the parents who never have disclosed and are now realizing that maybe they need to do that. And then there were like the recent NPEs themselves who I could just spot a mile away because they were just sort of radiating such intensity. And, like the feeling was just like sort of coming off of them in waves. And, and so I found myself, and I'm just a writer who has become a kind of public figure in this arena because of this story and this book, but with no training to psychologically advise people beyond my own experience. And I started seeing that there were therapists coming to my events who would say to me, what do you recommend I tell patients of mine who haven't decided whether they're going to tell their kids that their donor conceived?
You're asking to be an expert because of your experience being on the child side.
Right. I actually came up with, I thought a lot about it, and I thought, what can I say that will always be true, that is without any judgment, or, because I certainly do have feelings about children's rights to know, but what can I say that will be neutral, and true and helpful? And what that was and has been is they're going to find out. That's all. Do with that what you would like to, but they are going to find out. And I think that usually leads people to think, well, then I need to be open and let my child know the truth of their genetic identity and their origin.
Yeah. One of my services that I've started kind of specializing in is coaching parents who realize they need to tell a child. And I've worked with four couples now one-on-one to coach them through the sharing of the information with their child. 2 of them were couples in which their child was conceived from an extramarital affair. And the father, the husband, knew about it, but had always raised the child as his own. Their child's an adult now, but had ordered a DNA test. They were finally under pressure to tell. The other 2 couples were donor conception families. And the amount of fear and just anticipation of that sharing the news.
Yeah.
So huge.
Yeah. My heart, so many parents contacting me really I'm so glad you're offering this service. And
I'm actually working on kind of the landing page and getting it all set up to be able to do this as like a coaching package, because I figured out it really works to break it into at least 3, if not 4 individual sessions. And the first session is, tell me about your child and how it came to be that you realized you need to or want to tell your child. Then the second session is working on a letter together that includes everything they want their child to know. And whether the family uses that letter or not is up to them, but they have it there as backup in case they lose their words when they're in the middle of telling. And then the third session is planning the details of the when and the how, and really almost like building them up and encouraging them and reminding them of all of the good that can come from it. There's a different outcome. One of the families had 2 children to tell. One child took it really well and the other did not. So it really is so variable from family to family and even person to person.
Yeah.
Something that I think, there's counselors that understand the NPE trauma from a personal perspective. And so I send people that way if that's the type of counseling I think they need. And I think it's just going to grow more and more over the next couple of years, who's specializing in what and how we as a community are going to really triage people to where they need to be.
I'm curious, are you finding, in my sort of anecdotal experience, in more sort of recent, when the kids are young and parents are like on the fence or aren't telling or aren't planning on telling, it's often, I'm hearing, it's egg donor conceived. Where the mother, is like, I carried you, I gave birth to you, it's just a little bit of genetic material, it makes no difference. And that's like, I feel like the secrecy in our time now, where I think more and more people are kind of getting the memo that, that their child should always know the truth of their identity. More, not by any means all, but it feels like that's happening more. But and it's certainly happening in same-sex couples, where it has always had to happen. There always had to be a third person. But with egg donors, I keep on hearing that.
Yeah, there's still an embryo donors, which is when a couple has finished building their family and they have leftover eggs that were never used for their own family. They legally turn them over to another couple, and that's legally adopted. And then on the birth certificate, because the parents that have adopted that embryo are the mother and father, it's still continuing that the secret is being kept.
Holy cow.
Yeah. I've spoken to quite a number of different genetic counselor groups. And every time I do, I make it a point to say, all of you genetic counselors that work in the IVF world and ART world need to be on the leading edge of changing the way things are handled in the United States, because we know that these children that you're helping their parents to conceive, their children are going to find out one day. There's no such thing as anonymity.
From my perspective, it's so selfish. And it's on the part of the parents and of the people who are supporting the parents in that deception. I understand why. And I've done a lot of work to really understand in my own parents' case and in their generation, the way in which, I write in the book about presentism, you can't judge the past on the standards of the present.
Yeah.
But we are in the present. And
it's really, really frustrating. And it's frustrating to be working in the medical field and seeing your colleagues continuing to be a party to it, which is why I really encourage the genetic counselors, because they're the ones that really get the social dimensions to these decisions and really need to be the voices that are in those fertility clinics saying, like, let's change our consent form, let's change our brochures. I don't know. We're headed in the right direction. It's just so frustrating to be in a position where you can see that it's still happening and it needed to change like 10 years ago. We've known that it's the writing's been on the wall for a very long time. And yet we are still having to point out the obvious to people who know better by now.
Yeah. And less egregious than that, but still egregious, is the donor agencies, the sperm donor agencies, the egg donor agencies, who are listing donors as anonymous.
Yeah.
The intended parents choosing donors who are stating that they intend to be anonymous, even though there's no such thing anymore. I just talked someone out, a friend of mine who's becoming a single mother by choice. She has a surrogate who's pregnant now, but, she was going to go the anonymous donor route. And I said to her, it's hard enough to come into the world at all. It's hard enough to be born for all of us. You're having a child in even more complex circumstances than just simply coming into the world. And the chances are that child is going to be curious at some point about his or her, biological genetic heritage, and you're setting them up for rejection.
Yeah.
At the age of 18 to say, I signed that piece of paper saying I wanted to be anonymous. It's completely not okay. And the only people who are not really being considered are the children, which is why I feel like it's so selfish. It's so wrong-headed. Not just because they're going to find out, but because everything that that we're really starting to know about what it is psychologically and emotionally to have a genetic disconnect and not know it.
Yeah. Yeah, it matters. Family medical history is something you're asked at the doctor every time.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the irrefutable thing, is medical history. But there's also something that's a little bit more sort of inchoate and harder to pin down. And I know you've talked to Libby Copeland, the language that donor conceived people use. And I saw this in the little literature that I could find. I mentioned the pamphlets from New Zealand. There were literally 3 case studies of women who found out in their 40s or so that they were donor conceived. And it was so eerie, Brianne. It was like they were telling my story. The story of my childhood, the story of feeling like something was amiss, feeling like an outsider, somehow not fitting in, feeling like something, like I don't fit in, I'm an outsider, but I don't know why I feel that way, so there must be something wrong with me. Truly, I'm not remotely a, nature trumps all, I don't believe that at all. A huge amount of what formed me was nurture, but nature, we cannot pretend it doesn't exist just because we want to, and that's where I just get it's not a little bit of cellular matter. It's the essence of a person, and it's not the same thing as giving blood or donating a retina or a kidney. So anyway, the fact that we are where we are in terms of what our knowledge is, and that this is still on. Yeah.
So for someone who has not yet read Inheritance, I know there's many ways that they can do that, including an audiobook version. So where would you send a curious reader if they wanted to read or listen to Inheritance?
Yeah. So Inheritance is out in paperback. It's available in everywhere books are sold, but I always like to suggest that people buy it or order it from their local independent bookstore. There's also a website that exists now called bookshop.org, which is a compendium of like all of the independent bookstores in the country. And you can certainly get Inheritance there, or you can also order the audiobook. Or if you just want to kind of browse through my website, which is danishapiro.com, there are links to buy the book, basically everywhere books are sold. And that's on my website too.
Thank you so much, Dani. It's been a pleasure to have you. And I hope that many new readers learn of your book, not just Inheritance, but all of your past ones as well.
Well, thanks, Brianne. I've loved having this conversation. It's an ever evolving subject, and I feel very privileged and honored and lucky, really, in a way, to be able to be a part of it, because it feels like it's so important to so many lives.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of DNA Clarity and Support Podcast. Head on over to watersheddna.com to learn more about the resources and support available for those involved in DNA discoveries.